The rain had not stopped falling on Vareth 9 for 3 weeks straight, and Cadet Eli Morrow had stopped counting the days since he arrived on this miserable planet. He had also stopped counting the cups of coffee he drank each day, because the number had become embarrassing. Even to himself, he sat in the corner of the command bunker, watching officers move around him like he was furniture. Nobody asked for his opinion, and nobody expected him to contribute anything useful. He was just another body filling space in a war that seemed to have no, and his uniform told the story of his service better than any report could. Brown stains from spilled coffee covered his chest and sleeves, and his boots had not been properly polished in months. The other soldiers called him Coffee Stain behind his back, and some of them said it to his face when they felt like being cruel. Layla was not a bad soldier in the traditional sense. He had passed all his tests at the academy, and he knew how to shoot and follow orders. But he had never been exceptional at anything, and in a military that rewarded excellence, being average was the same as being invisible. The war against the Velkari Dominion had been raging for 2 years now. The Velkari were tall reptilian warriors covered in scales that shifted colors with their moods. They stood 7 feet tall on average, and they viewed humans as nothing more than pests that needed to be exterminated. Their empire had conquered 12 species before encountering humanity, and they fully expected species 13 to fall just as easily. Captain Vance walked into the bunker with his usual expression of barely contained irritation. He was the kind of officer who had never failed at anything, and who could not understand soldiers who did not share his natural talent. He looked around the room until his eyes landed on Eli, and his lip curled slightly in what might have been disgust or disappointment or both. "Morrow," the captain said without any warmth in his voice, "I have an assignment for you." Eli stood up quickly and nearly spilled his coffee again. He caught the cup just in time and felt his face flush red as a few drops landed on his already stained uniform. "Yes, sir," he said, trying to sound professional. Captain Vance did not bother to hide his contempt as he pulled up a holographic map of the region. A small red dot blinked on the far edge of their territory, marking a position called Trench 17 Gamma. "The 14th Division is pulling back to reinforce the Meridian Line," Vance explained in a bored tone. "Command wants someone to stay behind and watch this sector. It is a quiet zone with no enemy activity expected, but we need a presence there for political reasons." Eli looked at the map and felt his stomach sink. The trench was isolated and far from any support. It sat in a muddy valley surrounded by rocky hills, and the supply lines to reach it were thin at best. "You want me to hold that position alone, sir?" Eli asked, hoping he had misunderstood. "Hold is a strong word," Vance replied with a cold smile. "I want you to sit there and try not to embarrass the Terran colonial forces. Can you manage that, Morrow, or is that too much responsibility for you?" Several officers nearby chuckled at the captain's words, and Eli felt the familiar burn of shame in his chest. He had felt it so many times before that it was almost comfortable now, like an old wound that never fully healed. "I can manage it, sir," Eli said quietly. "Good. You leave in 1 hour. Take whatever supplies you can carry, because we will not be sending reinforcements. This is a watching assignment, nothing more. Do you understand?" Eli nodded and saluted, and Captain Vance turned away without returning the gesture. The message was clear enough. Eli was being thrown away, sent to a forgotten trench on a forgotten part of the battlefield where he could not cause any problems. For the real soldiers, he gathered his equipment in silence, while the rest of the division prepared for their own departure. Nobody offered to help him, and nobody wished him luck. He was a ghost already, invisible and irrelevant. The supply sergeant gave him a crate of rations, some outdated mines that had been sitting in storage for months, a portable turret that had been marked as malfunctioning, and a combat drone that sparked and stuttered when it tried to fly. It was garbage equipment for a garbage assignment, "Try not to die out there, coffee-stained," the sergeant said with a mean grin. "Although I suppose it would not matter much if you did." Eli loaded the supplies onto a small transport vehicle and drove out into the rain. The convoy carrying the rest of the division passed him going the other direction, and he watched their lights disappear over the ridge as darkness began to fall. He had never felt more alone in his entire life. Trench 17 Gamma was everything he had expected and worse. The position was a long muddy ditch carved into the valley floor, flooded with brown water in several sections and surrounded by nothing but rocks and dead vegetation. The previous occupants had left behind broken equipment and empty ration containers, and the whole place smelled like rot and despair. Eli set up his meager defenses as best he could and found a dry corner of the trench where he could sit. He made himself a cup of coffee using his portable heater and stared out at the empty landscape. This was his command now, a forgotten hole in the ground on a planet nobody cared about. He was about to settle in for what he expected to be a long and boring night when his scanner began to beep. He picked it up and looked at the screen, thinking it must be a malfunction like everything else he had been given. But the scanner was not malfunctioning. It was detecting movement, lots of movement, coming from the direction the Valkyrie controlled. Eli adjusted the settings and ran the scan again, and his blood went cold when he saw the results. 3 full battalions of Valkyrie warriors were cutting through the supposedly quiet sector, heading straight for his position. The scanner estimated over 1,200 enemy soldiers would reach his trench within 6 hours. He grabbed his communicator and tried the contact command, but all he got was static. The storm was blocking transmissions, or maybe nobody was listening because nobody expected anything to happen in this forgotten place. Eli Morrow sat alone in his muddy trench with a broken drone, a malfunctioning turret, outdated mines, 200 rounds of ammunition, and enough coffee to kill an elephant. He had 6 hours before an army arrived to destroy him. For a long moment, he considered running. He could take the transport and flee back toward friendly lines. Nobody would blame him for retreating from impossible odds. And honestly, nobody would probably even notice, but something inside him refused to move. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was just the anger that had been building inside him for 4 years of being treated like nothing. They had given him a trench to guard, and by all the stars in the galaxy, he was going to guard. I'd finished his coffee and stood up, looking out at the dark hills where death was marching toward him. A strange calm settled over his mind as he began to plan. "All right," he said to nobody but himself. "Let us see what a coffee-stained cadet can do." Eli stood in the rain and let the cold water run down his face as he stared at the scanner. 1,200 Valkyrie warriors were coming to kill him, and he had 6 hours to prepare for their arrival. Any reasonable person would have called the situation hopeless. But Eli had stopped being reasonable about an hour ago. He walked through the trench system with new eyes, seeing it not as the garbage assignment he had been given, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. His instructors at the academy had always said that humans won wars through cleverness rather than strength. And tonight he would find out if that was true. The first thing he examined was the malfunctioning turret. It was an older model that had been scheduled for disposal, and when he powered it up, the targeting system flickered and died almost immediately. But Eli had always been decent with machines, even if nobody had ever noticed. And he pulled out his personal toolkit and got to work. Problem turned out to be a damaged connection between the targeting computer and the firing mechanism. The turret could shoot just fine, but it could not aim on its own. Eli thought about this for a moment and then pulled out his personal tablet. With some creative rewiring, he managed to link the tablet to the turret, giving him manual control over where it pointed, and when it fired, it was not elegant, and it would require him to aim the weapon himself. But it was better than nothing. Next, he turned his attention to the combat drone. The small flying machine sparked and stuttered whenever it tried to lift off. and one of its rotors was clearly damaged beyond repair. Eli could not fix that, but he realized he did not need the drone to fly. He needed it to be useful. He reprogrammed the drone to act as a mobile sensor platform and removed the damaged rotor entirely. The drone could not fly anymore, but it could roll along the ground and broadcast signals. More importantly, it could play sounds through its damaged speakers, creating noise and confusion. The mines were old, but still functional after he tested a few in a distant part of the valley. He had 20 of them, which was not nearly enough to stop an army, but might be enough to slow one down if he placed them carefully. Eli pulled up the terrain maps on his tablet and studied the landscape around his position. The valley had 3 natural choke points where the rocky hills forced any approaching force to squeeze together. If the Valkyrie came from the expected direction, they would have to pass through at least one of these narrow gaps. He spent the next 2 hours placing mines and digging. The work was exhausting, and the rain never stopped. But Eli found himself energized by a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was purpose, real purpose, not the fake busywork the command usually gave him. He remembered something his grandfather had told him before he joined the military. The old man had fought in the colony wars decades ago, and he had survived battles that should have killed him 12 times over. The enemy will always expect you to fight fair, his grandfather had said. Your job is to disappoint them. Eli thought about the Valkyrie and what he knew of their culture from his training. They were proud warriors who valued honor and direct combat. They looked down on tricks and traps as the tactics of cowards, which meant they often fell victim to exactly those methods when fighting humans. He began to see the flooded sections of the trench not as obstacles, but as opportunities. He dug channels to redirect water into specific areas, creating deep mud pits that looked like solid ground. A Valkyrie warrior weighed nearly 300 pounds on average, and that weight would sink into the mud like a stone dropping into water. The rocky hills around the valley gave him another idea. The terrain was unstable in several places where rain had loosened the soil, and Eli realized that a well-placed explosive could bring tons of rock sliding down onto anyone below. He climbed up to one of the choke points and planted 3 mining charges against the cliff face, hiding them under loose stones and connecting them to a remote detonator. It was dangerous work in the dark and the rain, but Eli no longer cared about his own safety. He cared about making the Valkyrie pay for every meter they advanced by. Midnight, he had transformed the quiet valley into a death trap. Mines waited beneath false ground. Explosives clung to unstable cliffs. Mud pits lurked where solid paths appeared to be. And his jury-rigged turret watched over the main approach with hungry mechanical eyes. Eli returned to his command position and made another cup of coffee. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and cold, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He knew exactly what he was going to do and how he was going to do. I thought about Captain Vance and the other officers who had thrown him away like garbage. He thought about the sergeant who had laughed at him and the soldiers who called him Coffee Stain. None of them expected him to accomplish anything tonight, and none of them would probably care if he died. But Eli was not fighting for them anymore. He was fighting for himself, for every overlooked moment and every dismissive comment and every time someone had looked through him like he was not even there. The Valkyrie wanted this trench, and they were going to learn that taking it would cost them more than they could. Imagine at 0300 hours, his motion sensors triggered. Small lights blinked on his tablet, showing movement at the edge of his detection range. The first scouts had arrived, probably sent ahead to confirm that the trench was as undefended as their intelligence suggested. Eli watched the lights creep closer and felt his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it, the moment when all his preparation would face its first test. Either his traps would work or they would fail, and he would live or he would die. He took a sip of his coffee and set the cup aside. His finger rested on the tablet screen, ready to activate the turret at his command. He could see the Valkyrie now. Dark shapes moving through the rain with the confident stride of predators who expected easy prey. They were about to discover how wrong they were. "Welcome to Trench 17 Gamma," Eli whispered into the dark. "I hope you survive long enough to regret coming here." The first Valkyrie stepped onto what looked like solid ground, and the mud swallowed him up to his chest. His companions froze in confusion, and that moment of hesitation was all Eli needed. He activated the turret and watched it speak thunder into the night. The Battle of Trench 17 Gamma had begun, and the Valkyrie were about to learn why humans were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Dawn broke over Vareth 9 with a sky the color of blood and iron. The rain had finally stopped, revealing a valley transformed by a night of violence. Craters marked where mines had exploded, and the eastern choke point was buried under a mountain of collapsed rock. Bodies lay scattered across the muddy ground. Hundreds of Valkyrie warriors, who had come expecting easy victory and found only death, Eli stood in his trench and watched 900 enemies forming their battle line on the ridge above him. Their scales shifted to angry reds and determined oranges, and their eyes were fixed on the small figure below with a hatred that transcended species. This single human had humiliated their empire and killed their brothers, and they wanted his blood more than they wanted victory. Commander Kethran walked along the line of his warriors, his voice booming across the valley as he gave his final orders. There would be no more careful advances and no more small assault teams. They would charge as one unstoppable wave and crush the human under the weight of their numbers. Whatever traps remained would not stop 900 warriors moving together. Eli listened to this speech and felt a strange peace settle over him. He was going to die here, probably in the next few minutes, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. But death did not scare him anymore. What scared him was dying without meaning, dying as the nobody that Captain Vance believed him to be. He checked his rifle one more time. 43 rounds was not enough to stop an army, but it was enough to make a statement. Every shot would be a message to the Valkyrie and to the Terran officers who had abandoned him. Every kill would prove that Eli Morrow was worth something. The charge began with a war cry that shook the ground. 900 Valkyrie warriors poured over the ridge and descended into the valley like a flood of scales and plasma. They moved with disciplined fury, their feet pounding against the muddy earth as they raced toward the trench. Eli held his fire and watched them come. He had spent the night digging, not just building defenses, but preparing for this exact moment. The main approach to his trench ran across a wide, flat area that looked solid, but was anything but. He had undermined the entire field during the hours between assaults. Using his entrenching tool and the last of his explosives, he had carved out a network of tunnels and weak points beneath the surface. It was desperate work done by a desperate man, and he had no idea if it would actually work. 400 Valkyrie warriors made it 200 meters before the ground betrayed them. Eli pressed his final detonator and the world collapsed. The undermined field gave way in a cascading sinkhole, swallowing warriors whole as they fell into the tunnels he had dug. The ground itself became a weapon, dragging, screaming Valkyrie down into muddy graves, while their companions scrambled to escape the spreading collapse. Commander Kethran watched in disbelief as nearly half his assault force disappeared into the earth. This was impossible. This was insane. This was not how wars were supposed to be fought. One human had killed over 400 of his warriors with nothing but dirt and determination, but over 400 warriors remained, and they were close enough now that no trap could stop them. They leaped over the sinkhole's edge and charged the final distance to the trench, their rage overcoming their fear as they sought revenge for their fallen brothers. Eli met them at the trench line with his rifle blazing. He fired until his magazine ran empty, dropped 3 warriors, then slammed in his last clip and kept shooting. Each bullet found its mark with a precision born of desperation, and Valkyrie fell screaming into the mud when his rifle clicked empty. He threw it aside and pulled his knife. There was no time to think or plan anymore. Only time to fight and survive for one more second, then one more. Then, one more after that, a Valkyrie warrior lunged at him with clawed hands, and Eli ducked under the strike. He drove his knife into the soft scales beneath the creature's arm and felt hot blood spray across his face. The warrior fell and another took its place. And Eli kept fighting. He killed 6 of them in the trench before a plasma bolt finally caught him. Shot punched through his side and sent him spinning into the flooded section of the trench. The cold, muddy water closed over his head, and for a moment, Eli thought it was over. The pain was incredible, a burning agony that made every nerve in his body scream. But his head broke the surface, and he gasped for air, his hands clawing at the trench wall as he tried to pull himself up. Blood poured from his wound and mixed with the dirty water around him, and his vision was starting to blur at the edge as Commander Kethran appeared at the edge of the trench, his plasma pistol aimed at Eli's head. The commander's scales were black with rage and grief, colors that meant he had lost something precious and intended to take payment in blood. "You are just one human," Kethran snarled down at him. "How is this possible?" Eli looked up at the alien who was about to kill him and felt no fear. He saw the bodies piled around the trench and the smoke rising from the collapsed field. He saw the terror in the eyes of the surviving warriors and the disbelief in their commander's voice. "We do not fight fair," Eli said through blood-stained lips. "We fight to win." Kethran raised his pistol for the killing shot, his finger tightening on the trigger. This human had cost him everything, had turned a simple mission into a disaster that would end his career and haunt his nightmares. The least he could do was end it personally, but before he could fire, the horizon exploded with light artillery shells screamed down from the sky and impacted among the surviving Valkyrie forces. Plasma fire erupted from the ridge as Terran soldiers poured over the hilltop, their battle cries mixing with the thunder of weapons. The 14th Division had returned, and they had brought reinforcements. Commander Kethran looked up at the incoming Terran army and made the only decision that made sense. He ordered a full retreat, abandoning the valley and the nightmare it contained. His warriors fled into the hills, leaving their dead behind as they ran from a battle they had already lost. Eli watched them go through fading eyes. His blood was still flowing, and his strength was nearly gone, but he had won. Against all odds and all expectations, he had held Trench 17 Gamma until reinforcements arrived. He smiled as consciousness slipped away from him. One last thought floating through his mind before the darkness took him. Not bad for a coffee-stained cadet. Then everything went black, and Eli Morrow fell into the water as the sounds of victory echoed around him. The turret roared 3 times, and 6 Valkyrie scouts dropped into the mud. Their scales had shifted to a panicked white color in the moments before they died, and their companions scattered for cover behind the rocks. They had expected to find one tired human in a forgotten trench, not a fortified killing ground. Daily watched through his scope as the survivors retreated back toward their main force. He had drawn first blood, but he knew this was only the beginning. The Valkyrie would not run away from a fight, especially not a fight against what they considered an inferior species. 20 minutes passed before the next wave appeared on his sensors. This time, it was not scouts but a full assault force. 2 platoons of warriors moving in formation through the eastern choke point. They had learned from the first encounter and were being more careful about where they stepped, but careful would not save them from what waited ahead. Commander Kethran led the assault personally. He was a decorated veteran who had crushed human resistance on 4 different worlds, and he was insulted that his superiors had sent him to deal with a single enemy soldier. This should have been a job for fresh recruits. Not a warrior of his status, he ordered his troops forward through the narrow pass between the hills. confident that numbers would overwhelm whatever defenses the human had prepared. 30 warriors marched into the gap, their plasma rifles ready and their eyes scanning for threats. Ely watched them enter the kill zone and felt a moment of something that might have been pity. They had no idea what was about to happen to them, and there was nothing they could do to stop. I pressed the detonator. The explosion shook the entire valley as the mining charges tore into the cliff face. Tons of rock and mud came sliding down onto the Valkyrie platoon, burying them under an avalanche of debris. Screams echoed through the night as warriors were crushed and trapped. Their proud formations destroyed in seconds. Commander Catherine watched in horror as half his assault force disappeared under the landslide. The survivors stumbled back out of the pass, covered in dust and blood and wearing expressions of shock. This was not supposed to happen. Not against one human. He ordered a second assault through a different approach, sending his remaining troops around the western side of the valley. They moved more cautiously now, checking the ground ahead and watching the hills for more traps. But Ely had anticipated this. He activated his broken drone and sent it rolling across the muddy ground, broadcasting false sensor signatures that made it look like multiple human soldiers were moving through the trench. The Valkyrie adjusted their approach to flank what they thought was a squad of defenders, and that adjustment led them directly into his minefield. Explosions lit up the night as warriors triggered the buried charges. Each blast sent bodies flying and broke the momentum of the assault. The Valkyrie had never encountered this kind of warfare before, where the ground itself seemed to fight against the melee moved through his trench system, firing from different positions every few minutes. He would shoot from the north end, then sprint through the flooded passages to fire from the south. To the Valkyrie, it seemed like they were facing enemies everywhere, and their confusion grew with every passing hour. He had learned a trick from studying old Earth wars. Ancient human soldiers used to play music during battles to intimidate their enemies and boost their own morale. Ely did not have proper speakers, but he had the damaged drone and its crackling audio system. He programmed the drone to broadcast old Terran war songs, distorted and haunting through the broken speakers. The sound echoed off the valley walls, creating an eerie chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Valkyrie warriors, who prided themselves on their courage and discipline, began to falter. There was something wrong with this trench. There was something wrong with this human. By 0500 hours, Commander Catherine had lost nearly 300 warriors. His proud battalions had been reduced to nervous groups of soldiers who jumped at shadows and refused to advance without direct orders. The rain continued to fall and the strange music continued to play, and somewhere in that muddy trench, a single human was laughing at the melee was not actually laughing. He was too tired and too scared to laugh. A plasma bolt had grazed his shoulder during the third assault, and the burn throbbed with every movement. He was down to 60 rounds of ammunition, and his coffee supply was running dangerously low. But he was still alive, and the Valkyrie were still dying. And that was more than anyone had expected. When the night began, he looked at the sky and saw the first hints of dawn approaching. He had survived longer than he had any right to survive, and part of him wanted to believe that the worst was over. Maybe the Valkyrie would give up and retreat, deciding that this trench was not worth the cost. That hope died when he saw the movement on his scanner. Commander Catherine had called up every warrior under his command, over 900 soldiers, and they were forming a massive assault line on the ridge overlooking the valley. The commander was done playing games. He was going to throw his entire force at the trench in one overwhelming wave. And no amount of tricks or traps would stop that many warriors. Ely watched the army gathering against him and felt fear like a cold hand gripping his heart. He had 43 rounds left, 2 grenades, and a combat knife. His turret was out of ammunition, and his drone had been destroyed during the last assault. He had done everything he could do, and it was not going to be enough But then he thought about what giving up would mean. It would mean proving everyone right. Proving that he was just a worthless coffee-stained cadet who could not handle a real challenge. It would mean dying as nobody instead of dying as someone who mattered. Eli finished his last cup of coffee and stood up from his position. His wounded shoulder screamed in pain, but he ignored it. He had one more trick to play, one last gambit that might buy him a few more minutes of life. If he was going to die in this trench, he was going to make sure the Valkyrie remembered his name forever. He picked up his rifle and walked toward the sound of the enemy, ready to write the final chapter of his story in blood and fire and spite. The medics found Eli floating face down in the trench and assumed he was dead. One of them flipped his body over as a formality, ready to tag him for burial, and was shocked when the coffee-stained cadet coughed up muddy water and opened his eyes. "Is the trench secure?" Eli asked in a weak voice. The medic stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Yeah, soldier, the trench is secure. You can rest now." Eli nodded and closed his eyes again, allowing the medics to pull him from the water and carry him to the evacuation shuttle. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood, and the plasma burn had done serious damage to his internal organs. But he was alive when he should have been dead a dozen times over. The doctors at the field hospital worked on him for 8 hours, repairing torn tissue and replacing lost blood while they muttered to each other about how impossible his survival was. The human body was not supposed to endure what Eli had endured. But apparently nobody had told him that while Eli slept in a medical pod, the officers of the 14th Division walked through the valley and tried to understand what had happened. They counted 712 Valkyrie bodies scattered across the battlefield, and intelligence reports suggested that dozens more had died during the retreat. One man had killed nearly half of a 3-battalion assault force using nothing but broken equipment, and stubbornness. Captain Vance stood at the edge of the collapsed field and stared into the sinkhole where hundreds of enemy warriors had met their end. His face was pale and his hands were shaking, though whether from shock or shame was impossible to tell. "I sent him here to get rid of him," Vance said to no one in particular. "I thought this posting would be his grave." Colonel Chun, the commander of the reinforcement force, turned to look at the captain with cold eyes. "It nearly was. If we had arrived 10 minutes later, he would have died. You threw away a soldier who turned out to be worth more than your entire company." Vance had no response to that. The evidence was all around him, written in blood and carved into the landscape by a man he had dismissed as worthless. The news of what happened at Trench 17 Gamma spread through the Terran colonial forces like wildfire. Within days, every soldier on Verth 9 knew the name Eli Morrow and the story of how he had held an entire valley against impossible odds. They called him the Demon of the Trench and the Coffee-Stained Guardian and a dozen other names, each one a badge of honor that he had never sought. But the reaction in the Valkyrie Dominion was even more dramatic. Intelligence officers intercepted communications from the enemy high command discussing the battle in horrified tones. The word they used most often was Rethkai, which roughly translated to honorable nightmare, and described an enemy so terrifying that killing them brought no glory, only relief. They renamed Trench 17 Gamma in their official records. It was no longer a minor position on a forgotten battlefield, but something to be feared and avoided. They called it Rethkai Hollow, the Nightmare's Grave, and commanders who passed through that sector made sure their troops understood what had happened there. Legend of the human who had held the trench alone entered Valkyrie military training as a warning. Instructors used the battle as an example of what could happen when you underestimated humanity. The species that seemed so weak and so fragile could become something monstrous when pushed into a corner. Eli woke up 3 weeks later in a clean hospital bed far from the front lines. His wounds had healed thanks to advanced medicine, though the scars would remain with him forever. A nurse told him that he had visitors and helped him sit up before they entered. Colonel Chan came first, carrying a small box in his hands. Behind her walked a dozen officers that Eli did not recognize, their uniforms covered in medals and insignia that marked them as important people. Captain Vance was notably absent. "Cadet Morrow," the colonel said with a formal tone, "the Terran colonial forces owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid. Your actions at Trench 17 Gamma saved countless lives and changed the course of the entire campaign. The enemy forces intended to flank our main line, and your resistance delayed them long enough for us to respond." She opened the box and revealed a medal that Eli recognized from his academy training. It was the Silver Nova, the highest honor a soldier could receive for valor in combat. His hands trembled as she pinned it to his hospital gown. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "you are hereby granted a battlefield commission to the rank of lieutenant. You will be assigned to our Defensive Strategy Division, where your unique talents can be put to proper use." Eli did not know what to say. 3 weeks ago, he had been a forgotten cadet with coffee stains on his uniform. And now he was a decorated officer with a legend attached to his name. "Thank you, sir," he managed to whisper. The colonel smiled at him, and there was genuine respect in her eyes. "Thank yourself, Lieutenant. You earned every bit of this." Months later, after Eli had recovered and taken up his new position, a journalist came to interview him for a story about the war. She asked him to explain how he had survived that night, how one man with broken equipment had held against an army. Eli thought about the question for a long time before answering. He remembered the fear and the pain and the exhaustion, but he also remembered the anger that had burned inside him when he decided not to run. He remembered looking at the scanner and seeing death coming for him and choosing to fight anyway. "They gave me a trench and told me to watch it," he said finally. "Nobody said I had to fight fair." The journalist wrote down his words and asked another question. "What advice would you give to other soldiers who find themselves in impossible situations?" Eli picked up his coffee cup and took a long sip. The liquid was lukewarm and slightly bitter, just the way he liked it. His uniform was clean now, and his medals gleamed on his chest, but he had kept one reminder of his old life. A single coffee stain on his sleeve that he refused to wash out. "No matter how many times the quartermaster complained, never give up," he said. "The enemy can take everything from you except your choice to keep fighting. As long as you have that choice, you have a chance to win." He looked out the window at the stars beyond, thinking about all the battles still to come and all the soldiers who would fight them. Humanity was small compared to the empires that surrounded them, weak in many ways that mattered. But they had something that no other species seemed to possess. They had spite and stubbornness, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. The Valkyrie had come to Vareth 9 expecting to find prey, and they had left knowing the truth that every alien empire eventually learns humans do not know when to quit, and the most dangerous human in the galaxy is the one with nothing to lose, everything to prove, and enough coffee to stay awake through the apocalypse.